Hello all and greetings from Athens. I'm very sorry not to be able to participate in this workshop in person, but I will be of course following the proceedings most eagerly online, and I'm thankful for this opportunity of sharing my paper in this recorded format. I would like to today discuss two literary passages from the later 1st century CE and what they might tell us about Romans' emotional responses to the naturally circumscribed religious topographies of the provincial and free populations to the north and northeast of the empire. I believe that these interlinked passages, especially when read in the light of a handful of contemporary texts and juxtaposed with a few possibly relevant observations from other contexts of colonial subaltern relations, could offer us interesting pointers towards a reassessment of what exactly unnerved Romans in the northern Holy Groves. Let's begin by having a quick look at the passages that will serve as the starting point for this chapter. I'm sure they are very familiar to many of you in the audience, but a refresher is hardly ever amiss. In the interest of saving time, I will not read out the passages in their entirety, but you will be able to find them in your handout with the most crucial sentences underlined. Let's see, how do we change? Yes, very good. In the early books of the unfinished civil war epic of Lucan, De Bello Civili, there are a few passages that clearly tap into the contemporary Roman ideas about northern ethnography. The first one is a mock Caesarean ethnographic excursus on the beliefs of Gauls in Book 1, but it's the second passage in Book 3 that interests me today. It is an ekphrasis describing a holy grove near Massilia. The passage is very impressive in its emotive charge. There is an almost overwhelming feeling of suffocation, airlessness, corruption, and putrefaction of nature. The only human-made objects in the grove are formless, rotten effigies of wood. Absences are also used to define the place. No spirits traditionally affiliated with such localities frequent this grove, nor are there any animals. Even lightning is afraid to touch the trees. People are similarly absent, including even the priest himself of the place, who does not dare to approach the LOCUS even in midday, lest he might meet the god of the grove. This oppressive tone of Lucan's ekphrasis is important as we proceed to discuss the concomitant feelings of primordiality, memory, and grudge that the LOCUS embodies in Lucan. But first, let us have a quick look at Tacitian material from half a century later. Tacitus engaged with the same kind of imagery in a couple of occasions within his oeuvre. In his earliest preserved work, Germania, he describes the holy grove of the Semnones in ways where the motif of human sacrifices, atavistic terror, and feelings of oppression all come together. The Semnones used their ancient grove, consecrated, quote, by ancestral auguries and immemorial terror, to buttress their claims of being the oldest group among the Suebi. In preordained times, they gather at the grove, they sacrifice a human, and celebrate the primordial horrors of their barbaric rite. This can be compared to two other impressive and vividly described northern groves in Tacitus's later, more purely historiographical Annales. The first, Annales 161, describes the way in which Germanicus's troops find the lost legionary standards of Varus's unfortunate troops. After searching the, quote, secret corners of the forest, occulta saltuum scrutaretur, described as a dismal tract, hideous to sight and memory, visuque ac memoriae deformis. They finally locate the remnants of Varus's last stand and discover the evidence for the sacrifice of the Roman prisoners. Human skulls are nailed on tree trunks. Barbari Arai stand in neighboring groves. On them, the highest-ranking captives have been sacrificed in the aftermath of the Roman defeat. Jessica Seidman has rightly called it, quote, one of the most vivid, horrifying, poetic descriptions in the entire work, end of quote. The second Tacitian passage, in Book 14 of the Annales, describes the attack in 60 CE by Suetonius Paulinus's legions into the Isle of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, which is depicted as a druidic stronghold. The Roman landing force wavers when faced with the sight of black-clad women and druids chanting dire spells, preces dira supplatis. In horror, they freeze and are in danger of being cut down. Only the intervention of the commander saves the day, leading to the cutting down instead of the druidic groves where altars used to receive human sacrifice. Despite the vividness and sense of being present that is common to both Lucan's and Tacitus's ekphrases, all these passages are highly literary. The intertextual links between Lucan's and Tacitus's passages of these northern groves have been recognized for a long time and discussed as evidence for the literary connections between different genres in the Julio-Claudian and Flavian contexts. O.C. Phillips concluded that the episode of Caesar's felling of the grove near Massilia represented Lucan's own literary inventio in the ancient sense of the word, based among other things on Caesar himself, Hellenistic mythographers, and Ovid. He did, however, profess himself baffled by Lucan's possible reasons for including the passage, but we are, in some ways, better positioned for suggesting various motifs. A few years later, Stephen L. Dyson noted that Tacitus's Annales 14.30, the episode on the Mona, bears many similarities to Lucan's account. Dyson assumed that both Lucan and Tacitus had been directly influenced by reports, even eyewitness reports, of the events in Britain just before Boudicca's revolt. For him, the cutting of the grove on Mona was a real event, and Lucan had transposed a poetically augmented version of it to Caesar's time. But rather more interesting than to hunt for intertextual connections between these passages might be to ask the broader question: why did they strike a chord among the Roman audience of the later 1st century CE? The anxiety they seem to depend on, and indeed feed further, must have been a collective one, and also one that clearly could be triggered in a range of literary genres or registers. Already Dyson pointed out how both Lucan and Tacitus describe the physical features of the grove creating supernatural fear. Feelings of suffocation, restriction, and deep past are all very present. Here, the ancient writers seem to rely on their ability to trigger collective emotions in their audiences, which would, with some predictability, be prone to viewing northern forests with unease or even anxiety. So the passages clearly share a localization, the lucus, or grove. At least by Seneca's time, it seemed to be a commonly accepted observation that old-growth forests or groves of exceptional height would have brought to mind associations with the divine. In his close contemporary, the similarly Hispanian geographer Pomponius Mela, we find a combination of the imagery of grim woods and a compliment paid to the woodlands of Gaul, which are said to adorn the province, making it Amoinos. In Lucan's description of the Massilian grove, many of the elements that Seneca had included in his positive ekphrasis, the intertwining branches, the obscuring of the sky by the shade of the foliage, and the marvelous age, are notably turned into a source for anxiety, not admiration. They form, in the words of Florian Barrère, a negation antithesis of the elements that traditionally compose a locus amoinos. Both Lucan and Tacitus created their impressive set pieces by emphasizing the already existing connotations and emotional reactions through the deft manipulation of the themes of human sacrifice, atavistic grudge, and memory of conquest. Texts of the early imperial era frequently demonstrate an unease about the forested landscapes of Central and Northern Europe. But are sacred woods of either Romans or foreigners in some ways a special case among forests? Was their image shaped by the same set of cultural paradigms? What is striking in these acts of outcasting and mind reading is that Romans themselves were absolutely no strangers to the idea of a holy grove. As demonstrated by John Sheed, the lucus could be an unsettling and somewhat liminal place even when it was located in a Roman landscape that ostensibly was a stage for in-group religiosity. In the case of contemporary, mostly imaginary, barbarian groves, the soft archaism was replaced with a hard one. It could be asked whether Seneca's fidem numinis, is in fact very far off from the pavor, timor, and metus that are all cited in Lucan. Ancient Roman perceptions of holiness were often associated with a recognition of alterity, difference, and in a word, supernatural, of course. Richard Thomas has noted that the locus amoenus is open only to the pious. In Lucan's Grove especially, the horror of the unknown divine and fear of the possible divine punishment is palpable, and does not seem to have much to do with the piety of the visitor. Even the priest stays out. Stemming from this Roman imaginaire, Lucan has been characterized as having described an anti-grove by Augustakis, with none of the normal components of a pleasant grove. Breeze, animals, spirits, and humans are all absent. These all reverse the elements which Romans imagined as part of a delightful lucus, a lucus amoenus, if you will, whether it was a holy or not. Around the same time, Pliny the Elder too admires sacred groves as the majestic homes of divinities and connects them explicitly with the past religious practices before humans had begun building sanctuaries to the gods. It is this sentiment of primordial ritual practices and atavistic conceptions of the divine that clung close to the imperial era images of the grove. With this, we can move into discussing the role of the oppressive, claustrophobic lucus as the localization for ritual atrocity in these texts. As noted above, from the literary point of view, the intertextuality of the Lucanic and Tacitian passages is well enough proven. But what I'd like to explore today is what we can learn from these texts about the Roman imaginaire of the natural settings of northern barbarian religious practice, their rites, and what this may tell about the insecurities of the colonizing mind. After Caesar's conquest of the Gallic provinces and the establishment of the border along the Rhine under Augustus, Romans nonetheless remained nervous by the thought of the very populous, formerly hostile and stereotypically easily inflamed Gauls being now their provincial subjects. Even relatively low-scale unrest in the Gallic area was often treated with utmost seriousness, and the same can be said about any military defeats against the northerners. Partly, this was no doubt the result of the potent and frightening historical exemplar the Romans told themselves about their earlier clashes with northerners from the sack of Rome all the way to the Cimbric Wars. Northern peoples had for many generations been stereotypically known for their human sacrifice, or known, I should say. Quite apart from what was going on in the actual groves, this was the one detail that an average Roman would have known about their ritual life. The grove, meanwhile, was becoming synonymous with the ritual atrocities of northern peoples. David Frankfurter has observed in a more recent context that the ways of narrating ritual atrocity tends to produce scenarios with clear patterns, imagined as they are through cultural stereotypes. This seems applicable to the ancient sources too. Before Caesar's Gallic wars, such as in Cicero's speech Pro Fonteo, especially section 31, the accusations of ritual atrocity are not yet localized in groves, but the theme gathers strength in the immediate post-conquest period and remains vigorous for over a century. It is thus no surprise how in Lucan the grim Lucus near Massilia is obviously the site of human sacrifice. Human blood is almost implied to nourish the twisted, monstrous trees of the grove. Sed barbara ritu sacra deum, structae diris altaribus arae, omnisque humanis lustrata gloribus arbos. The corruption has already been seeping back up from the ground via the plurima nigris fontibus unda. The local ritual life and beliefs are all in perfect agreement in this imaginary lucus. The erroneous beliefs of the Gauls about the correct victims to the gods are also reflected in their lack of engagement with the divine, the priest who avoids the grove. Ignorance not only emphasizes the terrified belief in the crude effigies of the gods of the grove, but the horror of the place also furthers this ignorance. The priest actively shirks any contact with the god of the woods. Cessere deis, pavet ipse sacerdos accessus dominum petimet de prendere luci. Anxiously facing the lucus, the locals do not even want to know about the gods. This ties to Lucan's earlier ethnographicizing take in Book 1 about the Druidic doctrine of rebirth, which is so different from the beliefs of everyone else that, quote, only you has it been granted to know the gods, or only you remain ignorant of them, end of quote. In this context, the dwelling places of the Druids are also described as nemora altari mortis, lucis, which could have prepared Lucan's audience to associate the sacerdos of the Massiliot Grove as a Druid as well. The imagery of error in belief and horror in ritual life come together. In both Lucan's and Tacitus's groves, indications of human sacrifice abound. Unlike in Lucan, in Tacitus's Germania, the Semnones claim to know the god of their dream grove very well, and put forth claims about their own primacy among the Suebi, based on the divinity being the father of everything. This grove is in fact the only place in Germania where human sacrifice is mentioned. The only other element, the intriguing detail about anybody entering the grove having to do so in chains, seems quite similar to the general feeling of oppression and powerlessness that Lucan attributes to the sacerdos of the Massiliot Grove. In the other two Tacitian passages from the Annales, the emotional charge projected onto the northern woods is similarly tied to the sacrificial killings of humans. In Tacitus's description of the attack to Mona, the emotive charge, as well as the petrified stillness, is even applied to the Roman soldiers, and not just the voiceless subaltern barbarians or provincials as in Lucan, or indeed in Tacitus's presentation of the Semnonian Grove. The Romans waver in their attack when seeing the display put up by the defenders of the island. This fear is justified retroactively when the human sacrifices of the Druidic groves are revealed to them. The reader presumably was already supposed to know this detail. The grim connotations of the Northerners' religious and ritual behavior that momentarily petrify the legionaries are in the coda of the passage turned around in a triumphalistic resolution, where, much like Caesar in Lucan, the groves are destroyed, hacked down, and the fiery immolation that the Romans feared is meted on the Druids themselves instead. This can be compared with the gestures towards Roman emotions when encountering evidence for human sacrifice in the Germanic groves, which Tacitus similarly includes in his first passage in Annales. The emotional charge here is constantly underpinned by the implicit evocation of the emotions of fear and anguish felt by Varus's legionaries, but the whole episode is initiated by the explicit mention of the miseratio, pity, felt not only by Germanicus, but by the whole of his army. The landscape they traversed in their search is characterized as maestos locos visuque ac memoria deformis. The memory of the ritual atrocities perpetrated on the vanquished Romans by Arminius exacerbates the impact of the landscape in a way that is very similar to the effect that the cruel rites have on the living humans who approach Lucan's grove. The act of rhetorical mind reading, the imagining of emotional reactions undergone by both Romans and barbarians, is crucial to all these passages. In Annales 1.61-62, the painful memory of the Roman suffering is presented as an indelible connection with the grim Germanic forests. On the other hand, the distrust of the northern subalterns, Gauls in particular, could also stem from the inscrutability of the provincials. Here, the unknown forested landscape, or indeed just a shady grove, may function as a potent, though largely unspoken metaphor. Manipulating the audience response, such as the emotion of horror or anxiety, is of course very much what Lucan was aiming to elicit in his impressive description. The same aim of emotional reader response, or at the very least a description of pathos in a literary set piece, is clear in the Tacitian passages. But I believe new and worthwhile discussions can be had if we shift our focus slightly and look for the hazier image of collective emotions that arises from the texts of this era when they depict the nature-centered religious sites of the newly subjugated or still free Northerners. Forests had been occasionally connected with Northern ritual practices already in the classical Greek literature, but predictably enough, they became a more prominent feature of the ethnographic archive only when the Roman Empire spread into northern Italy and beyond, indeed. Considering the way in which the ethnographic archive of Greco-Roman perceptions about foreign peoples worked, and especially the way in which the pre-conquest forms and practices, pre-conquest customs and practices, tended to be the most distinctive ones, and hence the longest repeated throughout the literary tradition. It is not difficult to see why these forests and holy groves of the Northerners came to be associated strongly with the pre-conquest ritual life of these peoples, including the stereotype of sacrificial killing of humans. And not long before Lucan's time of writing, his fellow Spaniard Pomponius Mela had evoked Gallic ritual memories of the past in a passage which bound this into a close textual connection with the forested locations. Druids are supposed to teach the multa nobilissimus gentis clam et tiu vicenis annis aut in specu aut in abditis saltibus. A statement which is very little removed from his earlier observation how the vestigia feritatis iam abolitae, the remnants of the already abolished fierceness, still remain among the Gauls, so that whenever victims are taken to the altar, they still contemplate the ultimate sacrifice, meaning that of human victims. It is then quite easy to see why Lucan, whose epic was clearly intended to evoke feelings of anxiety, loss, and moral decline in its readers, and who moreover, as a writer, loved to feature ekphrastically elements that are gruesome, grim, and horrific, chose to highlight the Lucus Horridus near Massilia. His reasons were, of course, partly literary, but also very much in touch with his contemporary anxieties about the subjugated Gauls. In Lucan, the mind reading of the Gauls comes particularly clearly to the fore in their imagined reaction to Caesar's hewing of the grove, gemuere videntes gallorum populi. This is followed by a similar mind reading of the besieged Massilians, who expect a certain divine retribution on Caesar for his act of impiety, but this turns out indeed to be a false hope. The problem is that the divine in Lucan cares much less for the world and its peoples than the peoples themselves do for the holy places. Caesar's decisive action condemns the Gallic Lucus into the past, the way it is met with at the outset of the ekphrasis, Lucus fuit, already in the past tense. The above-mentioned passage in Pomponius Mela, which Tacitus would probably have been aware of, participated in the common first-century imagery of the nature-centered ritual spaces among the Northerners. Atavistic memories are very prominent in the passage of Tacitus's Germania on the Semnonian grove. This silva is presented as augureis patrum et prisca formidine sacram. The passage of Annales in which Germanicus's legionaries traversed the grim groves where Varus's soldiers were sacrificed, memories of the past haunt Roman minds, on the other hand. This Tacitian variation in what it comes to the connections of the passages with perceived memory construction and acts of mind reading, the subaltern, befits the range of textual and narrative environments that the descriptions stem from. The Semnonian grove comes across as a vignette of exactly the sort of indigenous holy place that was imagined as a source of potential problems in changing the ways of newly subjugated Northerners. With a strong origo narrative of exceptionality, implications of the Semnonian total submission to their ancestral god, instead of any external power, such as Rome, and the atavistic, proudly attended human sacrifices all make it into an other place that should cause anxiety to anybody even contemplating the conquest of the region. The grove on Mona in Annales Book 14 is localized right at the turning point of the conquest. The passage is particularly similar to Lucan in the sense that the audience is invited to witness the eclipse of the Lucus as it passes from the present to the past. The implications from the memories of the locals are more subdued, but it is notable that the passage 1430 ends with a somber sentence about Suetonius Paulus's pacification of the Mona being interrupted by the revolt of Boudica erupting on the British mainland. Though the causality is not explicit, the close narrative connection makes the reader associate the revolt as a reaction to the felling of the grove, an active backlash from the provincial subalterns. Lucan's and Tacitus's inverted gaze of the Roman colonizers looking at themselves as colonizers was a self-reflective variant of Roman imperial mentality, and as such, an affective ideal. Hence, its imagined other places, the loci horridi, were similarly expressions of not only ideologies, but also emotions. I believe the situation in early imperial era Gaul under Rome could perhaps be fruitfully explored through some appropriately conditioned parallels with later contexts of imperial knowledge regimes and emotional responses to natural features. The case of the British Raj in India is an almost instinctive parallel. The British imperial officials and administrators were subject to all sorts of scares, from poison panics, where the nature of the Indian subcontinent itself seemed ill-suited and harmful to the colonizers, perhaps slightly like the Germanic woods to the Romans, to all sorts of anxieties about the reclusive thuggies hiding in the dense jungle and attacking travelers, as well as persistent ideas about human sacrifices perpetrated by stubborn tribal groups in the depths of their unreachable forest homelands. In order to illustrate the potential for exploring the parallels between the discourses of the Roman era and the British Raj, let us take a brief glimpse at the last of these cases. In 1841, a captain of the Madras army called Samuel Charters Macpherson read a report at the Royal Asiatic Society, published 2 years later under the title An Account of the Religious Opinions and Observances of the Khons of Kumsur and Boat. He first emphasizes the limits to his own knowledge, stemming both from the poor understanding by the locals themselves of their own theology, the result of their, quote, low stage of intellectual advancement, end of quote. He then goes on to describe in detail the human sacrifices, so-called Meria sacrifices, among the Khons. A crucial detail of the localization, and I quote, the Meria grove, a clump of deep and shadowy forest trees, end of quote, and which usually stands by a little river a short distance from the village. In a strikingly Lucanic formulation, Macpherson notes how the Meria grove is, quote, kept sacred from the axe and is avoided by the Khons as haunted ground. My followers were always wont to abstain from seeking shelter within its awful shade, end of quote. He also described how in some areas, again, quote, small rude images of beasts and birds in clay are made in great numbers at this festival and stuck on poles, a practice of the origin or meaning of which I have been able to obtain no satisfactory explanation, end of quote. Characterizing the attitude of the Khons who attend a Meria sacrifice, he notes that the prevailing feeling is, quote, a fearful obedience to the express mandate of the terrible power whose wrath it is believed to place in abeyance, end of quote. Macpherson's account bears some fairly striking similarities to Lucan and Tacitus, both on the level of topoi regarding savage religion and human sacrifices, but also on the level of the imperial knowledge ordering and inquiry. But what is more crucial than his possible literary models, although that is another topic for another day, another paper, is that his own contemporary British audience was ready to share in these images. Many other writers expressed similar opinions regarding Khons and other jungle-dwelling groups. The various panics of the British Raj reflected the difficulties of information gathering and the weakness of the state in areas held through indirect rule. This points out to a constant imperial nervousness about the trustworthiness of the colonized groups, the loyalty of the colonized mind, something which would easily have been a factor in the first generations of Roman Gaul too. An imperial order of knowledge tends to be totalizing in its demands. It puts forward claims of complete knowledge, thrives on listings and norms, and makes conscious effort of locking the dominated peoples down into a kind of ethnographical stasis. The Pax Romana was seemingly conceived as a telos to the development of non-civilized peoples, much as in Strabo's Book 4 on Gaul. When entering the Roman domination, their own trajectories largely end, and whatever used to be ethnic to these societies enters the ever-growing ethnographic archive. The details of this ethnographic archive were prone to be deployed in their pre-conquest form, largely, as I have argued, because they had more distinguishing potential and more intrinsic interest to ancient audiences. Yet, together with this ethnographical interest, our sources may well offer some windows into the insecurities and anxieties of the Roman audience's minds as they contemplated the continental expanse of the northern provinces, imagined as thickly forested, potentially resentful, and until recently, or perhaps still, hosting cruel religious rituals. In Macpherson's vision of the Cond religion, the same force of religion to encode identity and communality is also present in what seems like a pointed advice to the British colonialists. I quote, "The common altar and distinctive worship reinforces the community's identity," end of quote. And the hill tribes even seek to tie wavering clans about to, quote, "abandon their ancestral faith for that of the more civilized people," end of quote, back to their old practices by involuntarily associating them in the human sacrifices. Claiming the persistence of human sacrifices among the conquered primitive groups and localizing this in the holy groves can of course always serve as a colonial justification, both during antiquity and the later era of European colonial empires. But the epistemological and emotional aspects of the forested localizations are clearly linked to a different phenomenon. Indeed, it is these parallel readings that I would like to develop further, especially in what it comes to discussing the anxieties evoked in the colonizing mind by the potent combination of forested landscapes and the continuation of pre-conquest ritual life. Let's see. How do I change this now? Yes. Very good. Sorry for that. So to conclude, in the light of the preceding discussion, I would propose that the anxieties about lucus horridus work in at least two complementary ways in Lucan and Tacitus. That is, in addition to their differing literary and authorial aims in their descriptions of the natural northern ritual space. Forests represented a concrete hindrance to the information gathering and administration of an empire, especially in a pre-modern context. But the prevalence of the forest anxieties in later imperial contexts as well seem to point out to a more metaphorical role of the deep woods. They encapsulate the resistance of the conquered area to the measuring imperatives of the imperial power, and in so doing can also become shorthands in the process by which the empire mind reads its provincial subjects. The landscape of dread pushes at the edges of the civilized Roman space, but along with this, the grim Luci of the Northerners also represent a pressure exerted by the past on the present. Cutting down a grove such as these is in our texts represented as an act that pushes the darkness further back, enlightening the barbarized space both literally and metaphorically. In terms of emotional responses, the more predictable and traditionally more often observed horripilation was to be expected in ekphrases of Luci horridi. But just as interesting is the somewhat more inchoate fear and anxiety about what such ritual spaces symbolize in the subjugated or still free northern minds. We go back to the mind reading. Yet when comparing the Lucanic and Tacitian texts to other expressions of imperial anxieties about the northern people's atavistic memories, the impression of a Roman anxiety about the Luci horridi of Gaul, Germany, and Britain gains strength. This is even before we cast a comparative eye towards the broader evidence from other contexts of empires on the verge of nervous breakdown, to quote the title of a recent article collection, where the forested landscapes are one of the most difficult to eradicate natural features, encapsulating the resistance, inscrutability, and the potential grudge of the colonized, conquered subalterns facing the imperial power. The Luci of the North derived their feelings of formido from a potent combination of deep age and the association with the pre-Roman era. In fact, they were a standing challenge to the totality of Roman control and could even symbolize the inscrutability of the provincial population's attitudes to their Roman-dominated present condition. Thank you so very much. For all questions and comments, I would be very happy to be contacted via, for instance, my email, ajlamp@utu.fi. I thank you.